Thanks for having me, and thanks for studying this book in such depth for such a long time, almost as long a time as it took to create it, actually. So, uh, I guess it's also, I was commenting earlier, it's a good time for me to sort of talk about the book because it's 15 years old now, and I kind of have a certain distance from it, so I can reflect on it critically um, and also with a certain amount of detachment, which is always nice when looking at your own work. It's nice to see it as something outside of yourself. If you're close to the audience that way. For me, it had a very long genesis. So the first thing I think about when I think about The Arrival is gosh, what a hard book to get off the ground in the first place. Mainly because I didn't know what I was doing, but I had a intuition that I really wanted to tell a story that would basically be as accessible as possible. And in the first instance, it had something to do with the feeling of displacement. And it wasn't necessarily a migrant story. It began as a very small sketch of a person. It wasn't necessarily either a human person, but it was a personage holding a package or a suitcase or some kind of bundle, arriving somewhere and looking at a strange creature. Some of this imagery comes from early Australian illustrations of Europeans encountering Australian animals for the first time. And so when Europeans first saw a kangaroo or a koala or a wombat or an emu, or especially a platypus, they were stunned, and it was a moment of extreme strangeness for them. And I guess I've always been interested in stories about strangers coming to a strange place or a stranger coming to our place. And that sort of stimulated my very early interest in science fiction as a young person, which has since fed into my work as an illustrator, and for a very convoluted journey, which I won't get into, has led me to doing picture books. Those were the people that would have me in the picture book publishers. So that's where I started working, and I've always been a writer as well. So it's interesting to sort of talk about a book with no words, but I began my career, at least aspirationally, as a writer, and I became an illustrator when I was asked by other writers to illustrate their work for them, and so I started to specialize in that aspect of an expressive profession. But to give a little context for The Arrival, just very quickly, I at that point in my, it was quite early in my career, I guess, if you can call it a career, and I had only a few years before worked on this book. It's hard to see, sorry, with the screen thing. Hang on, I'll turn this off for a second. Then you'll be able to see. You also see my studio. You see what a mess it is, which is great. It'll make you feel better about your own workspaces. Okay, here we go. So
I would say that our office looks pretty much, well, not as nice, but pretty much the same. Chaos.
Yeah, that shows it's being used. So messy space is a used space. Okay, so some of you may know this book, The Rabbits, but that was a very significant one in my, I was 22 when I did this project, so a very young illustrator, didn't really know what I was doing, but I was interested in science fiction and telling stories with pictures. And this was the first book I probably worked on which had almost no text at all. So it was like that amount, these little tiny sentences. And I started to become interested in the idea of telling very epic stories, because The Rabbits is about the colonization of Australia. And that's a very epic story, but telling it with, you know, almost hardly any language. So I was already quite interested in that. After that, I did the first book that I wrote and illustrated myself, called The Lost Thing. And there I also experimented with the divergence between the written story, which reads one way, and the pictures show something else happening. So I was already starting to do visual narratives without words. And these are both, interestingly, stories about displaced people. So in this case, the arrival of Europeans on a southern continent, which was just strange for them, and also strange encounter for the Indigenous people there. And the lost thing about which is the arrival in reverse, in a way. It's about a complete alien individual turning up in your home city, and what do you do about that? And then in between that and the arrival, I produced this book, The Red Tree. And this actually has a lot in common with the arrival, because it's a book with no story at all. There's no specified narrative. And it deals with loneliness and isolation. So with pictures like this, again, very little text, trying to experiment with the picture book form. And so when I first conceived of the arrival, it was as a 32-page picture book. Actually, it was a really simple book, and it was an old man just talking about his experience of arriving in a new country, in the same way that when I was talking to immigrants, including my father, for instance, who comes from Penang in Malaysia, and he came as a student to Australia, and he met my mother, who's Australian, and they got married, and he stayed for that reason. He probably wouldn't have been allowed to, actually, if it wasn't for marriage, because at the time, Australia had a pretty full-on racist immigration policy that discriminated against non-white people, and it actually using those words. So it was that's shockingly recent when you think about it. But yeah, it was called the White Australia policy, just in case there was any ambiguity about that. So he managed to sneak through and cause me to exist. Anyway, when he talks about his past and his impressions of coming to Australia, he's using English as a second language. It's not very precise. It's not very lyrical. And I actually like that way of storytelling. I'm very interested in imprecise, non-lyrical storytelling. Cicada is another good example, which actually borrows a little bit of my father's voice in talking about profound, deep, complex experiences, but with very simple, broken English. Pop my virtual background back on. There you go. So
very nice to see your studio, though.
The book began. It began with some sketches, and it was, as I mentioned, a 32-page picture book. It originated with some research into a part of Perth that used to be a Chinese market garden, so where Chinese immigrants worked, but they were quite separate from the British descent Australian community. So I'd read a story about that, and I'd done a little bit of research, and there were some old photographs, and so that was the trigger. And then it was just a very long process of development and many failed versions of the book. It's the book I've started the most times and stopped and shelved and then picked up again. And finally, I found a language in comics, a wordless comic, and I'd seen some examples by other creators, and something clicked, and I was like, this is the solution to my problem. And I went right back to my initial research, which was old photographs, much like the image behind us now. And I realized what attracted me to this, the feeling of this idea of the stranger turning up with the luggage in a strange place and encountering a strange creature. And I realized it was old photos like this. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if you had a book that was like a lost photo album? And it had all these pictures exactly like this, but they weren't from our universe. They were from a different universe. And wouldn't that be a better way of showing what it's like to migrate? If we're all of us as readers, and I include myself as a reader when I create something, I'm just a reader with everybody else. if all of us together are going to a place that we've never seen before, and there's weird signs with confusing language, and there's strange animals, and people do things in an unusual way, and you have to actually find a job and an apartment and all these things that are hard enough to do when you know, like myself as a non-migrant, imagine doing that in a place where you don't understand any, and that you haven't chosen to be there in the first place. So you're not even necessarily a willing participant in that universe. And so that was what I was aiming for. You know, that's a long answer to your question. I don't know if you'd like me to talk to some images, perhaps, and I could just continue, and I'll keep an eye on the time. And I guess in about 15 minutes we'll have some questions.
Yes, that would be great. So you said you have also maybe a slide to share with us, right?
Yeah, I think that's the best way of explaining some background to this book. The first thing I should say is when I start talking about this book is I hope it doesn't interfere too much with your own conceptions of the work. It shouldn't, because and I love what you said earlier, that it's sort of opened up for you and it has certain resonance and epiphany. And you know, you were in Japan at the time when you saw this book, and I know when a book is working is when it stops being about me. That's when I feel like, yes, I'm onto something. This book doesn't feel like it's about me. It feels like I'm just a medium for other people's stories and ideas that are in the culture around me, and I'm just listening. And I think most writers and artists talk about at least good working practice this way, is when it feels like it's quite relieving, really, when you're not really controlling a story or telling anybody anything. You're just a medium, you know, like a bit like a spiritual medium, but you're just listening, and the book starts telling you what to do. So also a shorter answer to your initial question is that, what does this book mean to me? It means an enslavement of about 5 years, where the book kept telling me what to do, and it was telling me, you have to do this book. And a lot of the time I didn't want to, because it was just such hard work and I was so uncertain about it the whole time. It looks quite confident in the final path, but I was really wondering if I was completely wasting my time for a number of years, and saying no to a lot of really great illustration projects, because this book kept drawing me in and I really had to finish it. And I'd signed a contract with a publisher, which is always a dumb idea when you've got a really big project. Do not sign a contract until you're almost done with something. And they were constantly, you know, harassing me about it, in a good way. But it was a burden for some time. And so it's wonderful that it's been so well received, because I can certainly imagine in another universe that it would not be. The other thing that I was worried about the whole time I was working on this book is, I hope nobody else thinks of this idea, because it seemed like such an obvious good idea for a book. You tell a migrant story in a fictional country. I thought, oh, there's going to be a movie coming out. I just got to hurry up and finish this book, because it has happened to other friends of mine. They've been working on a project, like a modernization of War of the Worlds, and then suddenly Spielberg comes out with one and they're like, oh, they just shelved their project. Or a friend who was working on it.
That didn't happen, but I heard that there are plans to make a movie out of it, right?
Yes. Although, you know, when you talk about plans in the film world, you know, there's a pinch of salt involved. A lot of plans in the film world. There's a lot of plans. I think it's got some good basis there, and there's always been interest, but it's there's a lot of things that have nothing to do with you know, mostly to do with money that complicate matters. But anyway, at least we know the film will come after the book, not before. I was just going to mention, just looking at the image in the background, it reminded me that I had a friend who was working on a very elaborate short animated film about the Titanic before anyone was even thinking about it. And then James Cameron's film came out and totally tanked his project. Anyway, not really a major concern for artists to have, but it's something, if you get a good idea, you might want to hurry up and just get it out there. Okay, so I'm going to try and start my slideshow. I got to remember, how do I do that again? I did it before quite successfully.
You have to, there is below, there is this button, share screen.
Ah, yes, there you go. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll just make this into a slideshow. Okay, so can everyone see that okay? All right.
Yeah. And just for
these are the sort of,
just for our participants, if one of the images is too big or something, you just can change the size by going with the mouse on the line in the middle and just move it. Okay, sorry.
Okay. So these are some examples of the sort of photographs that I was looking at a lot. I had very much like the same pin-up board that I have behind me. It all pinned up, lots and lots of old photographs for a long time, with me figuring out what do I do with this material. But I think the attraction to old photographs, and I've often worked with them, not necessarily on migrant scenes, but any old photos, and I've often collected pictures from deceased estates, that are in archives or museums or at flea markets, where there's lots of people, but I don't know who they are. And I think it's just a wonderful trigger for the imagination, especially when they're so old that you know that these people are not alive, and that sometimes for many of them, this might be the only kind of visual evidence of their existence on this planet. And so there are these wonderful images that are just, to me, always ask for narrative elaboration, almost like bring me back to life by remembering me, or at least imagining me, So it's like they're calling out. And so they're very haunting images, I find, when you think about that these people are no longer with us, and many of their secrets and stories have been taken to the grave. So also lots of images of, from Europe mostly, of devastated landscapes. I started off with a lot of Australian research because we're such an immigrant nation, but it quickly expanded out. And looking at contemporary examples, post-war examples, and a lot of stuff from around the turn of the century, when there were great waves of migration out of Europe to places like the United States. And we had that in Australia too, and we had a big wave in the 50s and 60s, which was a lot of Central European migrants, a lot of Italian and Greek migrants coming to Australia, German as well, to South Australia and other places. This is an image of the Great Hall at Ellis Island in New York, which was a processing station for many migrants at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And in the book, in many cases, I used some of those images directly. And they have special resonance for readers in those countries, although that's not necessarily important. Where possible, I try to avoid references to specific countries. So this is how the book looked when I was first sketching it out and showing my editor at the time. At this stage, I'd already figured out, I'd gone through a lot of versions of picture books that didn't work, and some of the early ones had words, so they had some sentences underneath each picture. And here I was trying to suggest maybe this could be a wordless book. And in Australia, there's quite at least at that time, less so now, but at that time I was working in a very fortuitous period because there was a lot of experimentation with picture books. And so you had a lot of unusual picture books being published in the throughout the 90s, and which is the time I started working. So I was doing drawings like this, very simple drawings. This is someone shopping at a strange marketplace. And I was writing sort of notes and, you know, very, very conceptual, scruffy, almost cartoon-like pictures. One of the first versions of the book looked like this, and it was based a little bit on the work of the British illustrator Raymond Briggs, who I was a big fan of, or am a big fan of, but I was looking at his work quite a lot at that time. And he, particularly two books, The Snowman and When the Wind Blows. First one is a book about a boy building a snowman, and it's a wordless book, and the format is one that I more or less borrowed for the Arrival in terms of page divisions, and it helped me a great deal. And When the Wind Blows is another book which is about two pensioners surviving a nuclear disaster. It's quite a strange book because it looks quite happy and sweet, but it's not at all. In the end, I ended up returning to the artistic feeling of the original photographs that I was looking at. And so as soon as I started working this way, it took a very long time to produce each image, but I felt so much better about the work, and I felt the universe opened up for me, and I began to believe in the story. It's very important for me that I feel that what I'm drawing is real, and it was starting to feel real. And I used myself as a model, and my wife is the wife in the book. We didn't have a child at that time, so I borrowed a child. And interesting, we have a daughter now, and a son. And maybe if I ever do a follow-up book, I've got more models too. But yeah, I had more hair back then, as you can see, and but that was sort of I discovered a way that I could do the book. I used people, my friends and family. All the backgrounds are all drawn, made up, but the people are often real in terms of where they're positioned, based on photographs. And so that's an early version of the book. There's a reworked version. It's just an interesting examples of style, different ways you can tell the same story in different styles. This is where I'm using photographs, so you can see some of my photographic reference, just for those illustrators interested. And I used to avoid photographs a lot, but for this project, I needed them for continuity, because I needed things to look the same from panel to panel. I've never drawn so many pictures in sequence before. That's the final drawing. And I think redrawing them this way creates a special feeling, which you wouldn't get if you did the book as a series of photographs, which would also be technically very difficult anyway. Here you see pictures of me. This is my working sort of photos of me sort of doing different actions to see what they look like. And I moved quickly from still photos to video. So I made short films of people doing things, and that became the basis for the book. I realized everything looked very staged when I photographed things, but if I just asked people to act out situations, it had a much more natural flow. And I thought of this book mostly as if I was making a silent film. So I stopped thinking about it as an illustrated book and thought about it as a film in pictures. So there's the final illustrations. And then a lot of this is a sort of storyboarding. As if you were doing a film, I would storyboard everything, except the storyboard then becomes the final product. And I studied books about film storyboarding to work out, to learn about sequences. It was a real learning curve with this book. There's a sketch. You see progressive development through different sketches, and very slow, laborious work. Each page in the book was about 2 weeks to do, I would say, because I was also having to do other work at the same time, since I made no money while I was doing this book, as is the nature of a lot of illustration. Looking at a lot of different architectural forms from around the world and trying to meld them together and creating a fictional world, a fictional city. and thinking about places I'd been to as a traveller, as well as the feelings that I experienced as a traveller. Since I'm not a migrant, but I could draw on the feelings of being displaced. And looking at photos of particularly grim places where people have emigrated from. And those became the inspiration for some of these illustrations of very dystopian worlds, with a metaphorical approach. This is a photograph of Sydney in the 50s. That photo, even though it doesn't look much like the following image, this photo is the basis for the following illustration. I always have to look at something real to create something imaginary. I very rarely just draw out of my head. I have to be responding to something in terms of a feeling. And then I just have lots and lots of little pictures, like menus of different landscapes and people and all sorts of animals and things. And that would become my reference in producing the book. Just different crazy drawings that then become, and photographs of places. This is an image from a Greek island, which became the basis for this illustration. I'd make sculptures of creatures. I often make sculptures of things that are harder to visualize. It helps me to understand how they look and how they behave and react to light. And so it's a lot like filmmaking that way as well, in terms of the concept development. The way animators will make clay sculptures of the characters that they're animating, even if they're two-dimensional, still helps. And so I would use those models in creating my illustrations. That's just where I'm starting to, like, this is the first time I actually started working digitally with drawings and photographs. You know, having had it, this was at a period where I just started discovering Photoshop, and although I'd never worked digitally in final artwork, I found Photoshop was great for doing all the stuff I used to do with a photocopier and scissors and sticky tape. In the pre-digital time, where I'd just be trying to compose images and get ideas. Now I could put things together digitally, so I could make paper models, photograph them, stick them on another photograph, resize them, and play around with lots and lots of ideas and find things that work. So even though the arrival is all handmade, it was made possible by digital processes. And so they all come together in an illustration like this. There's a little cardboard city that I built on my desk, and I just lit using desk lamps, and that became the basis for this dystopian world here. Just whatever's at hand that helps me to visualize something, I'll use. It's all very low tech and not very specialized, but you know, whatever helps me to create an image. Including some of these more complicated ones. All those figures are me. Almost every figure in the book is me doing something in terms of reference. Another storyboard sketch, landscapes. I don't think I'd actually seen snow at this point. So I was doing a lot of snowy landscapes, but growing up in Western Australia, never had experienced snow, but hope I got it right. And plants and all these little world building exercises, which I drew upon my experience for many years as a science fiction illustrator, and understanding that if you create a fantasy world, it's not anything goes. It has to have the same rules and systems holding it together as our world. It has to be built from the ground up. So there's a lot of, the book is kind of the tip of an iceberg, and there's a lot of ice under the sea to keep that floating up so it looks nice on the top. That's how I like to think of it. My favorite drawings are often like this. These are the like really good concept drawings where they're just quick biro scribbles. They're always the nicest artworks to me. It's like full of ideas and energy. And then the actual final appearance of the book draws a lot on old photograph albums, and I have quite a collection of old pieces of paper and documents, and I put a lot of those in digitally into the book with the artwork to create the illusion of an old photo album. And I was very pleased when I had the idea that the book was actually a photo album, because it occurred to me that this is one visual media that even if you don't read books, especially not picture books, everybody knows what a photo album is. And it's almost like the one form of comics creation that everybody does. Like a photo album is a comic that you make about your own life. And I thought, what a great idea for a book that, imaginary photo albums. And so, I really spent a lot of time trying to make the book look like a photo album. And I think it's good that it's a book that's maybe been read by a lot of people that don't normally read books for various reasons, and just because it's got such an accessible form. And that's the final book. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions, because I'm sure there's probably a lot of questions about the content of the story, which I haven't really spoken about much. Just to summarize, it was a very long project. It was a very solitary project, and it's a book that when it was finally published, I was quite surprised at the response to it, that it was so well received and understood and clear to people. And it was also that so many international publishers became interested in it very quickly, whereas previously I've been working for years trying to have books sold overseas and having very little success. And suddenly it's like all these different translations of the book were coming out, which was wonderful, and getting a lot of feedback. And the best feedback has always been from migrants themselves that have told me, this book is exactly how I felt. Saying there's certain scenes in the book that totally convey the feelings, and that's what I was trying to get at. The content doesn't matter; it's the feelings that matter in the end. And I think the reason for that accuracy is that I base so much of those illustrations on research of reading migrant stories and just basically translating the things that they had to say into pictures. So
it's actually amazing. It's actually amazing because it's also really, well, it's a really good example for something that we are also engaged here with, which is artistic research, of course, and it is like an artistic research project. It's interesting because the other day I was going through that book with my mother, and she is a migrant, and it was interesting because after the scene where the boat arrives in the harbor, and when the protagonist then gets into the registration process, she started to tell the story ahead of the pictures. Like she was saying what was coming next before she saw the pictures, and she was describing exactly the right thing. It was quite interesting. Yes. So I think it's really a very precise depiction of
Well, yeah, and the other interesting thing about the research is that I was looking for patterns, and across different countries and times, and you will always find patterns, and there were these patterns, especially immigrant processing, and things that happen when people were looking for work. There's this concept. So I had a filing cabinet, and in the filing cabinet, it was labeled different subjects. And whenever I found a little piece, a photograph or a magazine article about cooking or something, I pop that in, and then I'd go through and I'd think, okay, what have they all got in common? And that would be the basis for the picture. So I was kind of like looking for the universal connective tissue between all those experiences. And that's one reason, like you said before, the book's like more relevant than ever, that's been the tagline since it was published in 2006. Every year, more relevant than ever. And the reason is because the pattern is always the same. The patterns just keep happening again and again, particularly with issues of migrant processing and resistance. And but at the same time, I wanted the book to sort of transcend all of those issues. So it's up here in the dream cloud. It's like the dream we have, as if we've read all this material and looked at all these pictures, then we fall asleep and we have a dream, and the dream kind of compacts it all together into this one stream. And that's what I wanted the book to be. It'd be like, if you've ever had those epic dreams that just seem to go on for weeks in the space of 5 minutes, but they go on for weeks and they're full of detail, and you wake up and you know, you go to tell somebody, I had this amazing dream, and they just stare at you with glazed eyes, like, you know, please make this stop. It's so boring. But I really wanted to have that kind of, you know, if only you could sort of have that compressed experience as a dream, which then communicates to others in the same way.
Before we open the discussion, I have one more question for you. And this would be, I asked it to you before, like actually it's 2 questions. One would be, there are so many questions about your book, and I read interviews when I was preparing for this, and also like during the courses that we're doing and so on. And I had the feeling that it were all over the same questions, the obvious questions, which I think everybody has, like, what are the symbols standing for? Why is it a wordless graphic novel, and so on. But I would like to know if there is a question that really was never asked, but that you would like to answer, a question maybe that you have.
Yes. Well, not really, but there is one that I often think about myself, and I ask myself, and that's, what's wrong with the book, you know, or what don't I like about my work? Because I think you'll find this is true of most authors, certainly comics creators, that when they look at the final book, there's a feeling of disappointment, which is hard to explain. When the book comes back from the press, you know, in movies and that, they often show people opening a book and it's like, oh, my book, and they're all, you know, I'm like, it's like getting some bad exam results back. That's what it feels like to me. And I feel kind of, there's a feeling of disappointment. And I think one of the reasons is that when you start a creative project, part of the thrill is the limitless possibility. It could go in so many different directions. Like the way this book turned out is one of 1,000 possible ways it could have gone. And you're just holding one, you know? It's kind of a little bit disappointing. And then there's also a lot of technical problems with it that you see yourself. Hopefully it's at a level that other readers don't notice. But for me, it's like a concert pianist that'll always be thinking about that bad note, you know, in a beautiful performance. There's a lot of bad notes in the book, and so I often look at it and I think, oh, you know, that could have been better, or that could have been more precise, or there could have been a better metaphor there, or a better way of showing that. So, you know, there's that saying that a work is never finished, it's just abandoned. And that's really true. At some point, due to the pressures of reality, you just decide that's it, you know, it's done, or I've run out of time, and I leave it at that. I think the main criticism I have about my own work is I find that I wish it could be more metaphorical. Like, I don't know how, but even more strange and transcendental, and sometimes it looks a bit prosaic and literal and illustrative to me. But you're always sort of you're always aiming for something, you know, your reach exceeds your grasp. You're always aiming for something that you can't quite get. And I think for the arrival, it would be that a feeling of utter dreamlike strangeness. But then in doing that, you sacrifice a certain kind of communication and sense. So you're always just trying to find the boundary where you can create a story that's satisfying without being too obscure, but just obscure enough that it stays interesting.
Just obscure enough. Sounds good. Okay, thank you. I would open the round like now for the audience. If you have questions, then you can raise your hand and turn your camera on and your microphone. Exactly, Sophie. You're already there.
Yeah, so we've gone through this book in 2 different courses. I would like to preface this by saying you're literally one of my favorite artists ever. I think your style is incredible. It's very, very distinct. I think it's very nice to look at. And one of the first things I noticed with going through the book, the animals are adorable. I couldn't stop looking at them. I really want one. They're so cute. What was your inspiration for the animals? Because some of them for me kind of look like plants, I think. And how did you come up with those?
Lots and lots of drawings. Firstly, thanks for your kind comments. That's nice to hear. The main animal, probably the most interesting one, that's based on our pet parrot. So the personality of that animal is our parrot, and when it's like when you write about a character, you're often thinking it not necessarily consciously, but about somebody. What would they say in this situation? It's like, what would the parrot do in this situation? Like, and its face is quite parrot-like. It's almost like the spirit of a parrot without the feathers and all the other appendages. It's like a boiled down parrot. It's also based on the experience I had as a child of collecting frog spawn at a local. We grew up next to a swamp, and my brother and I would collect the frog spawn, and we'd raise the tadpoles in an aquarium into frogs and then put them back into the swamp. And the intermediate stage always fascinated me, where it's not quite a tadpole and not quite a frog. It's got these little legs growing out of its body. And so I really love that idea of something between a parrot and a half-formed tadpole. And it also creates the feeling in the book for me that the animal is in a nymph stage. It's like it's a juvenile. It's not a full-grown animal. It's a juvenile. And so there's something about that of him going to the room, and there's a baby animal that's itself still learning and evolving, and that they have to do it together. Like, this is a cultural thing. If you're a migrant, you have to go to a room. Well, in the room, you will find a creature that then you must be your companion. And then you must do everything together. I think that's really a nice concept. I probably didn't develop it far enough in the book, but sometimes the scope of the book doesn't allow for it. It's just not relevant to the story. But the relationship between the man and the creature, I think, is a really good one. But in terms of all the other creatures, I'd start off with an animal. I start off with an animal that I know. Often they're Australian animals like possums and koalas and things like that. And then I just drew them until, and like you say, combining them with plant forms and any other forms that seemed unusual. And there's just lots of versions until it looks about right. Sort of cute, but a little bit, I want them to be a little bit off-putting, so it's not cute, but you wouldn't want to touch it, sort of thing. And there's some scary ones in there too. Some scary looking creatures. But it was just like the idea of going to another country, and that's the one thing immigrants notice maybe more than anybody else is the plants and animals. They look really different. They sound different, and so on.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Hi. First of all, thank you for making time for us and giving us this opportunity to even ask you questions. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't even know about you until we read or looked at the Arrival book. And I was mesmerized, and I completely appreciate what you did. It's beautiful and it's amazing and meaningful. And aside from that, I had a question about if you had any advice for aspiring graphic novelists or comic artists.
Yeah, thanks. Mostly look at other comics and graphic novels. I learnt how I decided to do this project, and then it occurred to me it's a comic. Some way through, it just started looking like a comic. So I went to my local library, and I wasn't a big comics reader actually before this, but I went to my local library and I got out a few. I did some research. What are sort of current comics, and I just read a few really great examples. You can probably tell even from looking at the Arrival, if you know comics, you can probably recognize that I might have looked at Art Spiegelman's Mouse, that I might have looked at Chris Ware's Jimmy Corrigan, and a lot of other Marjane Satrapi, Persepolis, just really great comics, quite a range. And I read Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics. That helped me quite a bit. That's quite an old book now. It's probably been updated since, but that was a good guide to how are comics different from other forms of literature, and what's the history and how do they work. That helped me a lot to understand the language of comics a little bit. That's the main thing, to just sort of look carefully at what people are doing and learn that way. That's how I've always worked. I'm not very much trained as an illustrator. I've mostly learnt, I had some art training in high school, which was quite good. But after that, I've mostly learnt by just looking really careful at what other people are doing and trying to break it down, trying to just think, how did they do that? I'm always annoyingly stopping movies, pausing movies and rewinding. It's like, okay, so how did they actually do that cut? What happened there? I was so lost in that bit of film. So I was so following the action, but why was I so lost in following the action? So I go back and look at what they did. So being a real nerd, basically, about the art form, just like totally wanting to break it down like an engineer. And then the other thing is just drawing a ton. There's a lot of drawing. You can do comics without drawing. There's lots of ways to do it these days, but yeah, just the drawing and not losing heart when it feels like it's really hard and it feels like you've just been doing a lot of work for very little reward. That's always the feeling. My main advice to art students is to understand that the disappointment and depression with your own work is absolutely normal. I wish people had told me that when I started out, instead of thinking there was something wrong with my work or that I wasn't a good artist. Surely good artists don't feel this upset about their own work. It's pretty normal, but you get over it, There was a period in the Arrival, it was about 3/4 of the way, and I was absolutely depressed with the whole thing. Even though there was a lot of good work I'd done, I was just really depressed. And I just kept going. I just found ways to do this easier drawing task, almost like kind of therapy. I'll just keep working. And eventually I got over it. I started to be excited about the project again. Graphic novels are a really hard medium. You talk to any graphic novelist, they'll tell you it's a marathon type way to work. So you do have to have that stamina and yeah, just to understand it's going to go up and down like anything,
Thank you.
Okay, then I think it's more a comment from Julia Matlock. And she said that, or she wrote that it is maybe a consolation that the unlimited imaginations that your reader are developing with this one possibility that became the book could work
Yeah,
as a
that's right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, when you do the one version, it's still thousands of versions. So the other thing I'd say about that, and also just for the previous question, the one thing I've learned as an illustrator is that, and a writer, is that you're not telling anybody anything they don't already know. So your job is not to instruct, it's not to enlighten. There's no wisdom there, and it's almost like a stage hypnotist that helps you to do something that's already inside you and use your own imagination. So I've learned that an artist or an illustrator is or a writer is a co-creator. You're a co-creator with your reader. You're not creating for them. You're providing a stage with a few props and keeping it pretty open and clean. So I leave a lot of material out, and there's a lot of empty space in my work. There's gaps between pictures where nothing's happening. So comic creators will talk about that as the gutter, which is the term for the gap between panels. Those spaces are critical, and also just imagining that you're just the screenwriter and that the reader is the director. They're the one that are bringing it to life, and they're going to interpret it in their own way. You have to allow for that. So you only sort of do half a book. I only tell half the story, and I'm hoping that the reader, well, even less than half, maybe 10%, the reader will bring the 90% in. They've got the whole world in their mind already, everything they've experienced about language, about people, about food, temperature, weather, wind and rain. They all know that, and they'll put that in. So you don't have to do that much work. I mean, you have to do a lot of drawing, but you also got to remember you don't have to tell people everything, and you have to leave space, and you also have to be generous in knowing that the story will become their story. It's not about you. You're just sort of asking questions with the pictures. The question is always that you ask with every picture, does this feel right? Does this feel right to you? So someone standing at a table, with a suitcase, does this feel right to you? And then if it does, it's an invitation for you to imagine everything else that's happening in that scene. The sounds, the feelings, the sights, the smells, you imagine all that. I'm just asking the question, is this good enough to get you going? And then being able to carry your reader along without breaking that or messing it up too much with complicated information. So a big part of my process is editorial. Like, I draw lots of stuff and then I cut like a film director. There's a lot of stuff that's removed because it's going to interfere with the reader's ability to tell their own story.
Thank you. Anna.
All right, I think you can hear me now. Yeah. So I am in Jiré Gözen's philosophy course, and it started 3 weeks ago. So I got introduced to The Arrival only 3 weeks ago. And when I read it, I thought a lot about my mother because she has migrated to 2 different countries with me. And when she migrated from Iceland to Denmark with me, I was sort of like the little girl of the husband and the wife in the story. And I just immediately adapted, and it was all fun and interesting. But I hadn't really honestly properly put myself in the steps of how it must have been for my mom to adapt to Denmark. And I just wanted to let you know that I had a really good conversation with her after some reflection. And it was a really important moment where we kind of came to an understanding that we haven't gotten a chance to do before. Where I just kind of told her, Mom, I've come to some realizations about how hard it must have been for you to go through all that, and it was a really important moment, and I'm like, we're both really grateful for that conversation that we had. So I just wanted to share that with you, that that's
Okay,
an outcome of that.
Right.
I guess I also have a question for you, and that would be like, this has changed people's lives, and like this book, and I wanted to ask you, how did it change you after it came out, or while making it?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. First, thanks so much for that story, and that's yeah, that's really nice to hear. I haven't heard that so much in relation to The Arrival, but another book that I've done, The Red Tree, that's, I get a lot the comment that it's opened up conversations between people, and especially family members, sometimes to do with mental illness and other issues that are normally skirted around, or people don't have time to, sit and focus on. And I think I noticed that when I started to write less and less in my work, that would happen. That when you remove the words, it gives other people space to talk. If you're talking all the time, then there's not much room for them to add their own stories or have their own discussion. And I love too that in a wordless book, there's no pace. Some people read it really quick, and that's fine, like almost like get to the action. And other people, I see them looking at it and they're like, it's almost like reading a novel one word at a time and pausing on each word to think about the meaning. And because there's no syntax for a wordless book, there's no real way of reading it. You can read it super fast or super slow, and so there's a lot of time to have a chat about different things and go backwards and forwards. That's what I love about books. I like them more than film, because you can go backwards and forwards, and you can just, you don't even have to start at the beginning with some books. You can just start anywhere, so that's nice. But back to your question about how did it change my life. I think it made me think a lot more about people's inner stories, other people's inner stories. Up until that point, as an artist, I'd focused a lot on landscape and situations. And this was the first book where I had to draw a lot of people. And I was a very introverted, solitary person at that time. I didn't like socializing with people that much. I mean, I liked it, but I found it took up a lot of energy. It was like my mind's just gone, and I'd be exhausted afterwards. And certainly when drawing and painting, I really like to just do it by myself without anybody else's involvement. But as I was showing you with the process with this book, I actually had to involve a lot of other people necessarily in order to create the images. Like, it wasn't possible. I tried doing it alone by myself. I couldn't do it. So I kind of turned the house I was renting into a sort of a film studio a little bit. And I had all these props, cardboard boxes mostly, and lights. And I got a whole lot of different people over, and I said, look, this is a crazy project, but bear with me. It's an immigrant story, blah, 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 blah. Can you just make a cup of tea? I'm going to film you making a cup of tea. Or here's some weird Asian fruit I got from my local marketplace that you probably haven't seen before. Can you imagine how you would cook this? And here's some tools, some made up kitchen implements. Now just go. And I found that was actually the best way. Instead of telling people what to do, I put them in that situation. And I didn't direct them much anymore. I just said, okay, go. And I just filmed them, doing all this weird stuff, running away from giants, or trying to push a boat out to sea, and to observe them and then talk to them about it, and get some feedback. So it became kind of collaborative, and around the same time I was starting to work a bit more in the film industry, and so that book helped me to overcome my fear of working with other people, and including their stories in my stories. So I guess I hadn't really thought about that much until you ask, but yeah, that's probably how it changed me. I realized you can collaborate with other people without losing a very personal vision, you know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have 2 more minutes, but I think we have time for one last question since you're here. And Mert, you were raising your hand.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for being here. And yeah, my question is, for creative people, I mean, creative people in general, they tend to working on something, and a few minutes later they just have, a bunch of new ideas for different stories and all that, and me included also, because I'm also writing, and yeah, sometimes it just stress me out. And I like to ask you this question, if you maybe experience the same, and if you had any solutions for that, or yeah.
Oh, you mean the constant like wanting to move on to a different project?
Mm-hmm. To first to stick on the first project,
yeah.
And then finish it, and yeah.
Yeah, well, the best advice I probably heard from another writer was just one word, and it was finish. That was the advice, and it's pretty good actually, because yeah, the other good advice I heard from another illustrator was to get a really nice chair, because you're going to need it. So, well, I think your question, yeah, really gets to the core of a lot of this kind of work. And tying back into my answer to the previous question, it is solitary, so that makes it quite difficult. Projects with other people are a little bit easier, because you can each sort of bounce off each other's energy. And when one person starts to, in a film project starts to be a bit, down about it, another person's enthusiasm can help bring it up. And so, even having a symposium like this, it sort of brings up the whole collective level of enthusiasm about a subject. When you're by yourself, that's harder to do, working on a creative project. And I guess just hearing from other artists that they also don't create things lightly helps, when you hear that they have also wanted to quit in the middle of their project, but they kept going. Sometimes it's a matter of not worrying about what you feel like, you just kind of, sometimes I imagine myself as a puppet, and it's like, I'm just going to pull the strings. For this period, I know, because I'm not feeling so great about the project, but let's just, okay, we're going into string pulling mode, and I literally pick up the pencil, do it like that. So treat yourself as a machine, because sometimes if you're constantly asking yourself to feel good about something, that can almost be detrimental, because then the good feeling recedes even further. It's like trying to coax an animal out of its hole, you pulling and pulling and pulling, and it's just retreating and retreating. So sometimes I just like try to, with the arrival, I would just do like, when I felt conceptually a little bit challenged, I would just do something very menial, like some background shading or something. So I had I had certain things set up, because I knew I was going to get depressed. I've been working long enough to know that's going to happen. So I have these little activities set up, things that I can do that don't require a lot of inspiration, but is necessarily part of the art making process, almost like basket weaving, I call it, the basket weaving part of making art. I have them all set up so I can do those when I'm feeling, and it helps me to keep going, like to keep jogging through until you get a nice incline where you can just sort of run down nicely. So it's just knowing your own nature, and thinking about how you can overcome, look at things you've done in the past that have worked and you actually did, that helps. And then you think, okay, I can do it again. I can do it again. In terms of being distracted by other projects, I guess you just have to exercise a certain amount of discipline, because that is a big problem. You know, there's always going to be 10 really cool things that you could be doing instead of that thing you're doing now. You just have to kind of make a hard decision sometimes and say, I'm just going to stick to it because I got to finish it, you know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have 3 more questions, and I would say, that we just gather them together and maybe you answer them all at once. So one, Uwe Kügler is asking, last question, as a communication designer, I'm very interested in all the signs and typography you used. Is there a system in the book? And then Sarah Keusch and Ryan Faras are also raising their hands. So maybe you can just say shortly what your questions are, and then Shaun, maybe you can try to answer them all at once.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm sorry, my camera isn't working. That's why you will not be able to see me. I'm very sorry. I was one of the 4 people that did the logo for this whole symposium, which means, of course, we worked with your book quite a lot, and we went through every page and we looked at every single different picture and tried to find out what exactly the book is about. And as a designer aspect, I was wondering if the logo and the whole writing and everything, if that kind of for you actually describes your book in a way, or if we completely went past what you're actually trying to describe, because that would be very, very interesting to find out.
And then just shortly, Ryan, can you also ask your question and then all together? Ryan, we cannot hear you yet.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. So my question was because you mentioned and that I found that super interesting, is that you took inspiration from your travels. And for me, this overall book was also kind of like that, because I've never experienced immigration or something like that, but traveling has had a super similar feeling to that. And overall, the theme and the message you were trying to convey was, you said that it was mostly about a feeling. And my question to you is, was that the original idea that you were going from the get-go, or did that develop later on? Because for me, this book is more of a feeling than a book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the short answer is yes. It was always a book about a feeling, rather than a particular storyline. And so it was kind of like trying to find a storyline. That eventually I got involved in that more, but it was really always coming back to the feeling. And if you look at the book, you can take any single page and it's a little mini story. So each page works as an independent little mini dream, and that strung all together, they kind of keep you moving forward into a sort of story. So yeah, the short answer is I really just, as a mostly landscape painter, that's my background. I'm interested in the singular feeling of a thing. And if I can string them together into a lot of a narrative, that's great. But at the end of the day, I'm really trying to get this overall impression. I'm an impressionist painter in a way. I want the impression. I'm not necessarily that interested in the details at the end of the day, as long as they help the impression. And to the questions about typography, I love the design, by the way, if it's what I'm looking at now, is that right? And I maybe you were looking at my work and you're seeing I have a fondness for triangles. And I was working on some simple geometry like cones and certain curves. The symbols, I'm just trying to recall what the symbols were in the book, but generally speaking, they don't mean anything. And in my work, I avoid symbolism because I don't believe a reader needs to know anything much aside from normal everyday experience to understand a book. I don't like hidden meanings. for meanings where you would have to know something in advance, or that they're a bit too clever. I've done it in the past, and I've always kind of regretted it, like the sentence written in Finnish or something, which I thought was a very good idea at the time, but then I felt regret afterwards. It's like, because not everybody's, the fact that it's Finnish means that people are going to wonder about it, and it's a bit distracting. So and with the typography of the world, that language, there's no real system. There's no system, I'm sorry to say. Kids always ask me that, you know, is there an underlying, you know, like Tolkien runes or something, and or is there Elvish? No, it's completely random. And basically I got a Times New Roman alphabet, and with numerals, cut it into quarters, each one, and I rearranged the bits of paper until I found shapes that I really liked. I thought, yeah, that looks like a good letter, you know, I like that. That's a believable typography. And so I had a lot of fun playing around. But if you look closely, which you would know if you work with typography, you can see very clearly bits of the letter A, the number 2, 3, and they're the way they're kind of like put together. And that ended up being far more convincing to me than many of the hand-drawn imaginary typefaces that I was creating. It seemed to work better to, the book itself is collage too, because it's using old photographs and different things. And so the typography is the same. It's using existing things.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I think we're going to close this first session. Thank you again so much, Shaun, that you came to visit us today and tell us so much about your work and give us this like really also personal insights. Thank you for that.
You're welcome, and thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, so great to be able to speak to you in this forum. Feels very respectful of the work. And it's nice also to be talking about some of the finer points of the book too. It's actually in many countries it's considered a children's book, so which I believe it is a children's book too. But I'm often at pains to say, you know, it wasn't my intention to create a children's book. It was a book for the way in which the experience of migration turns you into a child in some ways. But it's not it's a book for everybody. So it's great to see that that's the case. That speaks to so many of you.
Yes. Yeah, it's actually, I even forgot to ask this question, because I think it is a question that you've been asked a lot, right? That it is considered to be a children's book, but
yeah,
from a lot of adults.
It's a children's book publisher that initially published it. So
yeah. So in the chat, you can see comments and thank yous if you want to have a look at that.